Good afternoon. My name is Gerard Seitz, and I'm a professor for organizational behavior at the Ivey Business School and the executive director of the Ihnatowycz Institute for Leadership. Before I formally welcome the Honourable Marie Sinclair and Maria Tremonti, let me say a few things about the land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgements conducted by non-Indigenous Canadians are inspired by the 94 calls to action contained in the Truth and Reconciliation Committee of Canada, chaired by the Honourable Marie Sinclair. They are formal statements recognizing the historical and ongoing relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories on the land now known as Canada. A criticism of land acknowledgements is that they may be superficial and feel like lip service or ticking boxes. It is important for each of us to understand that land acknowledgements are not meant as an outward performative expression, but a call for each of us to deepen our understanding of the cultures and worldviews of Indigenous peoples, how we can all participate in decolonization, and how each of us can repair our fractured relationship with the earth, her land, water, air, and creatures. Thus, to continue our journey of deepening our understanding today, I want to go beyond the traditional land acknowledgement and tell you something you may not already know about the Haudenosaunee peoples, the first peoples in whose traditional territories we live and work. Among the nations of the Haudenosaunee is a core value called the seventh generation that ensures that the well-being of descendants, or those who are not yet born but who will inherit the world, is taken into consideration when making present-day decisions. Nations are taught to respect the world in which they live as they're borrowing in it from future generations. Therefore, I'd like to challenge you to reflect on how adopting or weaving in Indigenous worldviews would have and still can benefit all humanity. For instance, ponder this. Do you think that if those who came to colonize North America over 7 generations ago heard, respected, and adopted the 7th generation value, rather than ignoring or trying to eradicate it, that we would still be in the mess of climate today? Do you think that if we came to actively value this principle right now, that we would still be acting so slowly to reduce emissions, clean the oceans, and live more sustainably? I would now like to formally welcome the Honourable Marie Sinclair and the renowned Canadian journalist, Maria Tremonti. The Honourable Marie Sinclair is a former judge and senator, best known for his work as chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The Commission published its report in 94 Calls to Action for Reconciliation in Canada in 2015. There are so many things to say about Senator Sinclair, but in an effort to be succinct, I'd like to simply share the following as an example of his character. In the weeks since the news broke regarding the discovery of the remains of the thousands of Indigenous children found in mass unmarked graves, Senator Sinclair has stated he has been inundated with calls from residential school survivors. He shared that there were, and I quote, hundreds of calls, often just to cry. I can hear not only the pain and anguish, but also the anger that no one believed the stories they had told. Senator Sinclair made the time to take these calls and ensure these survivors felt heard, valued, and believed. It is remarkable the myriad character dimensions Senator Sinclair is able to activate amid what must be his own grief and anger. His deep sense of interconnectedness with people, empathy and compassion, a sense of justice, composure, resiliency, reflection, and to retain a sense of optimism for a better future. But perhaps what is even more remarkable is that these character dimensions are not only being displayed by Senator Sinclair, but by countless Indigenous people from coast to coast to coast as they continue to stand their ground, seek justice, reclaim and revitalize their cultures and languages, and strive to have their nations not only survive, but flourish. Many of us would know Maria Tremonti as a Canadian radio and television journalist. She has the gift of tackling everything from the politics of the day to the changes that affect our society, to the stories of individuals whose personal journeys, traumas, and triumphs affect us all. Senator Sinclair and Maria Tremonti, it is an honor to host you today. Thank you for joining us, and I look forward to your conversation on truth, reconciliation, racial equality, and Indigenous perspectives, and their implications for leadership, education, business, and society. Maria, over to you.
Thank you very, very much. And Senator Marie Sinclair, What a delight to be able to talk to you today. Hello.
Hello, it's good to see you again, Anna Maria.
And I should tell our audience that you've spent the first half of this day chairing these negotiations. I'm guessing you can't tell us the details, but the negotiations on compensation to Indigenous children, that an issue of successive federal governments has been fighting in the courts, and now you are going to, you are trying to facilitate an agreement. And so you're a very busy man, and thank you for taking the time for this.
Oh, well, you're welcome. And you're right. It has been a very busy and hectic day. I just went briefly and saw the representatives from Canada and a couple of the other parties to make sure they were doing the homework that I had assigned to them and that they were prepared to come back and continue to talk. So yeah, it's been a hectic time. It's not an easy thing to resolve, of course, but I think it's important.
You know, I want to set this scene a little bit as we begin our talk today. We're at a really important crossroads in time right now with a pandemic, with the reality of climate change. Finally, I hope being recognized on a visceral level as we see the world around us, especially in BC right now. And seemingly, hopefully, a society that is beginning to understand its culpability and also the need for rapid change in our societal relationship with Indigenous people and Indigenous nations. Those big issues have collided with myriad other issues right now: science, medicine, economics, business, political polarization, geopolitical polarization, not to mention deliberate misinformation that we have to wade through. And at the same time, we're having this conversation before an audience of people who aspire to become leaders. And you are a leader with much to share. And you are also known as a patient man. But I'm going to share a moment of seeming impatience on your part because I want our audience to understand. So I have a clip. Could we please play the clip now?
Many people have said over the years that I've been involved in the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, why can't you just get over it and move on? And my answer has always been, why can't you always remember this? Because this is about memorializing those people who have been victims of a great wrong. Why don't you tell the United States to get over 9/11? Why don't you tell this country to get over all of the veterans who died in the Second World War instead of honoring them once a year? Why don't you tell your families to stop thinking about all of your ancestors who died? Why don't you turn down and burn down all of those headstones that you put up for all of your friends and relatives over the years? It's because it's important for us to remember. We learn from it. And until people show that they have learned from this, we will never forget. And we should never forget, even once they have learned from it, because this is a part of who we are. It's not just a part of who we are as survivors and children of survivors and relatives of survivors, but as part of who we are as a nation. And this nation must never forget what it once did to its most vulnerable people.
Senator Sinclair, that was such a powerful moment. What were you thinking as you watched yourself there?
I was actually thinking it would be you that would play that. So I knew that you were likely going to do that. I have actually played that for other people who ask me the same question or try to make the same point, which is where they say, why can't we just move on? And as I watched the video, I think of the heaviness that it really does create for all of us, and that we who are the descendants of the survivors, and we who are the descendants of those who were here at the time that this was all going on, and who may have had, in fact, a connection to those who did this in government, or worked in the schools, and even the newcomers must all feel the weight of this process of reconciliation, because even if you weren't here, you still have a responsibility to the future of this country, and therefore you need to understand this. And that's why it's important. We do need to remember, and it's because I keep thinking back to the time when we were beginning the work of the TRC, and one of the staff who were working on drafting the report and putting together the beginnings of the report said, how do we make people care? How do we make them care? And I said, we make them care because we want them to know that this is their story too. And I think we did that.
Oh, I think you did too. And I think, we do learn from remembering, as you said, and we can't move forward until we remember, can we? Really, any society must remember.
If we do move forward without remembering, then we are not the people that we should be. We are not the people that that history really fashioned us to be, and we are doing things without realizing why we're doing things and understanding why we are who we are. And I know that for young Indigenous people, for example, today, their question often is, why are things like this? Why are things the way they are? Why is my family in so much trouble and hurting so badly? And why don't we have better communications in our community? Why don't we have better economies? Why don't we have a better sewer system? Why don't we have better housing? And when they learn this history, then they know why. And the one thing that they learn from that is that this is not their fault, that they are the victims of this history, and they now need to learn how to turn it around.
We hear the word reconciliation a lot. What does that word mean to you?
It is about respect. And I've said that from the very beginning, that reconciliation is about establishing a respectful relationship, a relationship of mutual respect, in which we respect each other. And I've said, and using other words, I've said, reconciliation turns on a very simple concept, which is, I want to be your friend, and I want you to be mine. So when you need my help, I will be there to help you. And when I need your help, you will be there to help me. Because that's what this country should be about, that we are respectful of each other. But the one thing I have also pointed out is that Indigenous people have so long been oppressed and victimized by this history that we need to understand that before we can have mutual respect, we have to ensure that Indigenous people are given the opportunity to develop self-respect. And that's a precursor to the first, that's the first step to the mutual respect relationship we're going to have.
And that speaks to the kind of negotiations you are chairing now. That is all part of that attempt to give respect and to honor respect.
And it is. And it's also about understanding why young Indigenous people feel so angry about climate change, and they feel so angry about the negative impacts of mining and resource companies are having with the environment. And they're beginning to understand their relationship based upon their teachings with the earth and their responsibility to the earth and their responsibility to future generations. Because all of that now is coming back to them through the work of elders and through sometimes the literature materials that have been developed. And so young Indigenous people are beginning to stand up for what they believe their people, their cultural groups that they're connected to stood for. And they want to stand for that too. So it is about recognizing that there is an ongoing process of change that is before us. And some of that change, incidentally, is not is not positive. Some of it is negative too. We do see young, angry people out there. And it's often reflective of the philosophy of people like Frantz Fanon, who said, one of the impacts of colonialism is that the victims of colonialism take it out upon themselves first, because they begin to believe the stories that they're told about their inferiority and their lack of rights. And so they begin to see themselves in a bad light. And then they'll take it out on their neighbors. And then they'll take it out on people who are around them, and people who come from other places too. But he said, eventually they will take it out on their oppressor. And that's when things will really change. And they won't necessarily change for the best.
So how do we recognize those concerns in very concrete ways so that the anger and the frustration that a new generation feels and is talking about and is trying to act on can actually be answered in a constructive way forward, not only for them, but for all of us?
Indigenous youth are really looking for answers from their own elders and from their own community leaders. And that's where the answers really do need to come from, it's their grandfathers and grandmothers and their community elders who need to be the ones to share their wisdom with them about what their responsibility is to the future. And that will come from understanding their teachings. I often tell people, when I was a young lawyer, I quit law. I quit being a lawyer. I said, I'm not going to do this anymore because I don't want to work in a system that is doing such bad things to our people. And I quit. And then I went to see an elder shortly after I made that decision. And I went to see him and I told him what I was doing and that I was going to make it a permanent step. And he said, you can do that if you want. You can go become a carpenter, become a mechanic. He said, but if you do that, you will be a mechanic who knows the law, and people will know that you know the law, and they will still come to you to ask you for your advice and for your help. So it's not like you can run away from that. So don't think you can run away from it. He said, what you need to learn really is how to be the best lawyer that you can be. And in order for you to be able to do that, you have to learn what it means to be an Anishinaabe. You have to learn what it means to be an Indigenous man. You have to learn what it means to be a husband, to be a father, to be a son, to be a grandson. You have to learn what it means to be a leader in your community, because then you will be the best human being that you can be. And that's what all of our responsibilities are. But for Indigenous people, it comes from knowing who they are.
There's so many tentacles to what you say, because that young lawyer named Murray Sinclair went on to become the first Indigenous judge in Manitoba, and then a senator. Now you're chancellor at Queen's University. Sorry, Western. But you have worked in. You forgive them, they forgive you. But you have worked inside and continue to work with the very institutions that historically had a goal of Indigenous genocide and that currently barely acknowledge that history or the policies that remain. And so what was that? Tell us more about that inner struggle that you went through.
Well, as I said, initially, my temptation was to leave. My temptation was to walk away from it because I didn't think that there was room for me. I didn't think that I would be able to make myself fit into that. And I didn't want to try to make myself fit into that. I wanted to do what I thought was right. And I didn't see myself being able to do what was right in that particular environment. So after I had a talk with my elder, a good friend at that time, Angus Merrick, who's long since left us. After I had that talk with him, and of course I had many other talks with him over the years, but the one thing that he convinced me about was that you don't have to change for this system to work for you. You can make the system change, and you need to figure out where you can do that. I didn't set out to change the system, to be honest with you. I set out to be a lawyer within the system. That was my initial ambition. But as I flipped my thinking in that way, I began to see that there were certain things that the system was doing that were wrong, that needed to be changed. And so I thought, well, maybe if I start to draw attention to those things, they will become things that can be changed. And I have made a number of observations or recommendations. I've chaired 2 different major inquiries that have looked at those things. And I have to say that the change has been slow, but the negative creation of this particular situation has been slow too. It took 150 years for us to get into this mess, as I've often said, and it may take us that long to get out of it. But the real key in the long term is the way we teach our children, so that when they are relating to each other, they will relate to each other better, and they will help each other to make this system work better as well.
And, you know, by the commissions that you have chaired, the fact that this is on the record, documented, that this is also part of the history to be remembered and to be acknowledged, means that it cannot be erased in that way either. Now it's on the nation's record, what has been done and who has suffered and how much suffering there has been because of the work you've done.
I know. I've often gone to places and been invited to address small groups. And I remember this one place where I went to, this young lawyer came up to me and he said, when I was in law school, he said, we studied a guy named Sinclair who wrote a report about the justice system. He said, are you related to him? And I said, yeah, I am. And he said, oh, how are you related? And I said, well, at that time I was smaller, younger, and had black hair, but that was me. And he said, no kidding. And he said, wow. And so the reality is that they are studying the impact of the work that I've been involved with. And it isn't just me, you know, my colleague, Justice Hamilton at the time, was a tremendous resource as well. And my colleagues on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission were also a great resource. And they continue to do their work in this country as well to speak to groups. But I do acknowledge that I have become a bit of a lightning rod when people start to look around for who they want to listen to. And I accept that responsibility. You know, and I tell people I was raised by my grandmother because my mother passed away. When my grandmother always wanted me to be a priest because she saw the priest as the one who was responsible for the people, who took care of the people. And so when I told her as a young teenager that I didn't want to be a priest, I finally got up the nerve to tell her that. She said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to go to university. And she said, well, if you're going to do that, then you have to promise me that you will not just become an educated bum, but you will do something with that education and you will do the best that you can with it. And so every time I wonder about whether I'm doing the right thing, I can hear her voice in my head, and she's either saying, yes, that's the right thing, or she's saying, no, you got to change that. You got to do better than that. So there is that voice that still talks to me.
I was going to ask you where you found your moral compass and your strength, because you absorb a lot of other people's pain in the work you do.
Yeah, I acknowledge that. I do a lot of ceremonies. I participate with elders, and they're very gentle with me. They take care of me. They make sure that I'm in a good place. A few occasions, they've often called me up and said, you have to come and see me. And I said, really? And they said, yeah, we need to do a ceremony with you. And I said, okay, so then I'll go and see them and they'll do that. But they know even before I do, when I need that effort on their part. And I'm very grateful for that. I'm very grateful for the support that we got from survivors. Whenever we finished listening to them at the end of the day, we always did a debriefing session and we did a ceremony with them at the end of each day. And so that allowed all of us to be able to walk away from that day without the sense of the futility of the heaviness that we were carrying. We still carried the heaviness, but it was because it made us more determined than ever to do what we could with it. And I think in the long run, we wrote a pretty good report.
Mm. Oh, I'd have to agree with you there. And I'm sure your grandmother would be very proud of you. You know, so many of those listening right now
She would
are
have, no, let me tell you this, she would have said it's too long. So,
well, fair enough, I guess, huh? But
the
it
full
needed to
report,
be.
the
It
full
needed to
report
be.
is pages. Yeah.
Remind us how many pages? I'm sorry.
The full report is over 6,000 pages. The summary report is still 400 pages, so it's still a long summary.
Again, important for history and for remembering to have that on the record, all 6,000 pages. That's a lot of lives in those pages.
It is.
A lot of
talked-
hurt lives.
We talked about a lot of people there, yeah.
Yeah. You know, there are a lot of people who may think that there is a social connection to reconciliation, and they're not wrong. But I would argue, as we're talking to business students, there is also an economic and a business link, and there are many, many links to reconciliation that we need to think about, and that new leaders need to think about, because it's not solely how we act as individuals, but it's about how we go forward in our work and in our policies, the people we vote for. Can you talk to us a little bit about that all-encompassing, you know, the number of tentacles that reconciliation actually reaches?
Yeah, one of the first things that when I talk to business councils and business people, one of the things that I talk to them about and I try to get them to understand is that there is an economic impact of the kind of oppression that Indigenous people have gone through that has held Indigenous people down and back for a long time. And they need to keep in mind that from an economic perspective, Indigenous communities, Indigenous tribes, Indigenous people were self-sufficient long before the European came here. And in many ways, we're much better off than the Europeans were who were on them. There's stories of potlatches and sundances, which involve giveaways, incidentally, where the host, the one who was putting up the potlatch or who was hosting the sundance, his responsibility is to give to the community, to take care of the people in the community who do not have. And so in one case, and if you go to the National Museum in Ottawa, you'll see a big display of it on the wall. But in one case, they did an estimate of all of the things that he gave away. And the value at that time was that he gave away over $100,000 worth of gifts and items to the people of the tribes who came to his potlatch. And so that would be in the millions of dollars now, because he was a very wealthy man. And now the people of that community are impoverished because of the limitations that the Indian Act has placed upon them. But the thing that we all need to understand is that if we can ensure that people have a very basic means, they have a basic means of living, if they have a livable income on a regular basis, then they will be healthier. Their social lives and their social activities will be more positive, that they will be able to take better care of their houses because it'll be their house. They will be able to clothe themselves and feed themselves better because that will be something that they will do. And there is not one situation where money that has been paid into an Indigenous community or provided to an Indigenous community has not compounded itself in benefiting local economies as well. It often hasn't benefited the individual because it doesn't actually go to them. It'll go into the local community where they buy materials to build houses, they buy materials to be able to involve the community in other kinds of activities. But there is an economic spin-off and benefit that we need to recognize. And that if we can all collectively ensure that Indigenous people are part of the economic growth of this country, then we will see that the economics of this country will also grow. But people don't see it that way. They think that it's wasted money. Somehow it's like money that goes down a black hole and disappears. And that's not the case. It comes back and benefits other people and benefits society. And there's been many studies that have pointed that out. And we need to understand that, with currently a discussion going on in Ottawa, for example, about a guaranteed livable income for people in society. And the guaranteed livable income studies have all shown that if you provide people with a guaranteed basic income, that will benefit the economies, the local economies, much more than the current welfare system that we now have.
Well, this also raises all of the propaganda and misinformation we have been fed over generations about the knowledge that Indigenous people have that we have not appreciated as non-Indigenous people. The scientific knowledge, the knowledge of forests, the knowledge over like the climate change things that Indigenous people in the North saw long before anyone else noticed. But we have not acknowledged any of that until very recently, and then not enough. So there is, it seems to me like great opportunity to start making space for that knowledge in a much greater way.
I remember one of our advisors at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission by the name of Peter Inuk, who used to be the commissioner for the Northwest Territories, or for Nunavut, I think. And he was reading an article about the finding of the Franklin expedition and how much money they'd spent to find the Franklin expedition. He said if they had spent just 10% of that money in the communities up north, he said, all those Inuit people up there could have easily led them to where those ships were, because we knew, and we have always known where those ships were. And yet they never asked us. They never thought that we knew anything. And that's truly unfortunate, because that's true for just about everything. The Haida people in the West Coast, every summer they hire a group of young people, or they pay a group of young people to go out on the land. And their job is just to go out and stay on the land and live on the land and travel around on the land, and then to come back and meet with the elders on a regular basis and tell the elders what they see. And they were the first ones to actually see the beetle infestation that was destroying the trees now in northern British Columbia. And they told the elders, and the elders then reported that to the environmental forces in the province. And they did nothing with it, because these were just kids wandering around in the bush as far as the environment department was concerned. But they were speaking the truth, and they had reported it at least 2 years ahead of the issue becoming as prominent as it was.
Well, we've seen the destruction of the boreal forest because of that beetle. That leads to my next question. A part of, and Gerard mentioned this as well, the Indigenous worldview that includes the understanding of the impact of decisions on the next 7 generations. In the corporate world, a lot of people just look to the next quarter. In the political world, many officials just look to the next term. In the social world, the buzz lasts minutes, right? So how might non-Indigenous leaders and aspiring leaders learn from Indigenous beliefs and practices about how to how to make decisions that have greater effect?
And that's a very good question. And to a certain extent, it's circumstantial in the sense that it depends on what kind of a decision-making process you need to engage in. Because some decisions in the business community are about immediate needs and immediate actions. And so those require a different approach than the long-term planning. I think part of the problem is that we don't do enough long-term planning, long-term thinking about what is it that we're going to do? What is it that we're doing to the people? What is it that we are doing to the environment? What is it that we are doing to the animals? What is it that we are doing to ourselves as human beings? And the question that I think we need to ask ourselves is, how do we plan properly, and how do we think it through properly? How do we find our balance as individuals within this overall competitive world that we are thrust into? And finding our balance is key to all of this. And finding our balance at a personal level is one thing, and also finding our corporate balance as an institution is also very important. And that means also making space for those institutions and organizations that are dedicated to doing what they can to speak up for the environment, for the animals, and for those elements that we do know that in the long run our children are going to benefit from. So it is about understanding what those teachings are and understanding what the elders are saying. And I have a good friend back home who runs a lodge in which he invites corporate leaders to come and sit with him and just talk with them and ask him questions. And he is glad to respond to their questions. But it's always based upon what he says is, these are the teachings of our people about that. And I think that kind of conversation would be very helpful to every leader. And those who have been there in their assessments of the utility of that process have always been very high.
Are there some guiding principles you can share when it comes to finding that balance?
Well, the first thing is it's how you treat your people, the people who work for you, the people who work within your organization. Treating them as you would treat your relatives, as you would treat your mother, as you would treat your father, as you would treat your brothers, your sisters, your cousins, as you would treat people who are part of your circle. I think that's the first thing that the corporate world needs to learn, is how to treat its people and treat them well. We are driven by a capitalist philosophy which says that it's important to be successful by earning lots of money and to centralize that money into as few hands as possible. And whether we admit that or not, that's the way the process is inclined to push us. It's like a systemic bias within the system that's how the system works. And yet, if we reorient our thinking around that so that we are more considerate of those who are helping us to gather that income and gather those profits, and be more sharing with those who are helping to pull it together, then I think that's a worthwhile endeavor. There's a study that I'm sure all people in business schools now are looking at about the fellow who owns a company, and he decided to make $70,000 a minimum wage for anybody who worked for him. And by giving them the minimum wage, he had a dramatic impact upon the local economy. He had a dramatic impact on their lives. Their loyalty to him increased substantially. And he didn't suffer financially that much. He still had a very nice life as a result of that, because his company prospered. and his company got more business than it ever had before. And it's because of the way that he treated his people. And there's a lesson to be learned there. The way you treat your people is probably the biggest asset that you got and the biggest tool that you can use and learn how to use. And there are other things about, respecting your community, respecting your environment, respecting the places where you have an impact, and recognizing that in the long term, you should be asking yourself, what am I going to do to this place? And what is it going to do to my children's relationship to this place? Not only my child today, but my grandchildren and their grandchildren. And the children 7 generations from now. That's the teaching of the 7 generations. Think about them when you make those big decisions. You'll be long dead by the time they're here. There's no question of that. And you may think that you don't care, but they'll care and they'll think about you. And they may not think very well of you. So you have to think about whether that's important.
And what you're talking about and respecting those who work with you and for you. Right now, in the midst of COVID, we're already seeing, we're not sure where this long tail of COVID goes, but we're already seeing changes in workforces and the demand of workers to be treated with greater respect and in better conditions. We are seeing a change in that as well, which follows along the very guiding principles you're talking about.
Yeah. The way that people are beginning to learn how to manage people who are working remotely is really telling. All of my daughters and my son all work remotely, and they will tell you that whereas they used to have supervisors who would almost get in their way, now they very rarely hear from the supervisors, and their supervisors are almost lonely when they call them. So it's like there's a better relationship there. So I'm not sure that we're ever going to go back to a situation where people are not working remotely. So and maybe we need to think about how we can make our future business world succeed as well by using a combination of that process as well as bringing people into a work environment, because not everybody needs to be in a closed environment in order to be able to do the job.
What about educators? How do post-secondary institutions, how do they become more inclusive, more understanding of reconciliation? What do professors and chancellors and others need to think about as we try to move forward in a more inclusive way?
Well, it begins with looking at the kind of education that you're providing and how you're focusing in developing your course programs. Many universities, post-secondary institutions, including universities, started orienting their thinking process towards the business world or the business environment, so that they started to focus upon developing faculties that had a very business and utilitarian impact upon society, as opposed to its historical role, which was to develop thinkers and develop philosophers and develop artists, and develop writers and things like that, where their not necessarily primary, but their significant function was to influence the way a society grew, society developed its sense of self and its existence. Now we don't seem to pay as much attention to that part of it as we do to developing programs that will allow us to graduate more people who are going to make a contribution to the economy. And that's that's been a significant change. And I think we need to begin to understand that while that's important, we still can't lose sight of that other aspect of education that's also important, and that is those change makers who are going to influence who we are as a people, as a nation. And so let's always remember them. But the other thing is, of course, is that we also need to think about even those that we are educating to be utilitarian participants in the economy. We need to ensure that they receive a balanced education about themselves and about their role in society as well.
Again, it comes back to taking care of the individual.
It does. It makes it very much about ensuring that the human being who is in front of you, or who you are educating, is given the opportunity to be the best human being that they could be.
And, you know, I see another connection to business, and we just saw it with the big climate change conference in Glasgow, when investors who collectively were worth trillions of dollars said they want to be part of investing in the technologies and the businesses that will either mitigate climate change or adapt to it. So when business speaks, politicians and society listens. Like, businesses have a lot of power to change not just their own businesses, but the way we move forward as a society.
And they also have to learn to look at it not as another business opportunity, though. And that's sometimes the way they approach it. So it doesn't always necessarily have to fit a business model, but at the same time, there can be that element to it. And we shouldn't dismiss it just because it does have a business model element to it, or a profit-making element to it, or an income-generating element. But we do need to ask ourselves is what's the ultimate benefit of doing this? And if the ultimate benefit is going to be that we as a people are going to be able to live better, that we as a people are going to be able to live on a land that will stay with us longer and will be protected, sometimes from us, then we should encourage that to happen.
And that can change policy and politics. And if I'm going to ask you about politics and policy, I'm going to ask you, what do you think the greatest challenge for Canada is right now? What's our greatest challenge, and what should we be thinking about?
Well, I think our greatest challenge in this country is the environment and environmental change. And Indigenous people, Indigenous leaders, Indigenous elders will tell you that too, that they are more concerned than they have ever been about the fact that they're seeing the land being so devastated, not only by economic activity, which concerns them, but also just by the changes in temperature. The Inuit people in the Churchill region around the Hudson's Bay tell you that they now see polar bears walking around the bay through their communities, whereas before the polar bears used to walk across the ice and go north. And now they don't see that as much because the ice doesn't form until later in the year, long after the migration to Churchill or to the bay itself starts. So the bears start wandering through their communities, and that presents significant challenges to those communities because they're not prepared for large numbers of bears coming in that way. And that presents a danger. It also creates impact upon their local food supply and things such as that. And so they will tell you that the way the environment is going is of greatest concern to them. Indigenous people, of course, also are concerned about the issue of reconciliation. And I think that's important. Changing the relationship that Indigenous people have with this country is important because Canada has come through a significant period of oppression, of what I am not shy to call white supremacy, treatment of Indigenous people. and they need to atone for that, but they also need to recognize that we have the opportunity and the means now to not only just to bring an end to it, but to repair that. And so that's important too. And I think they can go hand in hand, because Indigenous leaders will tell you that their people are still eager to learn, to teach, and to show how to live off the land properly.
Do you see that happening? Do you see that way forward? Like, do you actually see some progress on that front right now?
On reconciliation?
Yeah, on the kind of reconciliation you're talking about with, with the environment, with.
I say the biggest challenge to reconciliation is lack of planning. And people are not thinking in the long term about where they want to go and what they want to do and how they want to stage their work around reconciliation. When I do presentations to corporations around the world, and that's one of the things they ask me is, what can we do about reconciliation within our corporate world? And I said, the one thing you need to do is you need to develop a plan, and you need to look at what are the milestones of success that you're going to need to see, or you're going to want to see. You want to increase your staff, but then you also want to ensure that your staff can work in a culturally safe environment. You also want to ensure that your non-Indigenous staff are also kind of brought along and not forgotten, that there's a way of ensuring that mix works. And so you need to ensure that you work with both groups, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. You need to also recognize that there are other cultural groups within your corporate community that you need to pay attention to, not just Indigenous people, but also about your role in helping society to come to terms with this long history of oppression too, because corporate Canada has a role to play, because they're benefiting from it. They're the ones that have access to the resources that have not been properly dealt with with Indigenous people.
You talked about the need to make people care. And it was just this spring that we were reminded, because of course we had been told before, but we needed to be reminded of how many graves there are of children at residential schools. And we saw a nation be shocked. We saw the shock of a nation. And it's not unrelated to the work you're doing right now. I'm just wondering if you see the concern that came from that, does it translate to the kind of concern that needs to continue in all aspects, in business, in society, in politics?
In significant parts of our world, yes, I see it. I see it in the educational field. I see it in some church congregations. I see it in groups within society, that want to know more, that want to learn more, that particularly ask the question, what can we do? What should we do about this? And who themselves now know how to react. I was just telling the group here this morning that last night I received a phone call that 2 young Indigenous teenagers, girls, are reported missing in the city of Winnipeg now. And that's almost 5 consecutive weeks where somebody's gone missing in Manitoba. And there is a growing concern that there are predators out there who are taking advantage of them, and nobody seems to be doing anything about it. And so, well, we certainly need to talk about it. We need to bring it to the public's attention, and we need to ask them to be more vigilant and to be aware of what's going on. And part of that is that we know they care. We know that they can imagine what it would be like if this was their daughter or their granddaughter. But we also need to give them the tools and the understanding about what they can do. And that's key. And it's difficult sometimes to have those conversations, but we need to have them. And that's sort of become my raison d'etre. That's why I accepted this challenge that I was asked to come in on. And it is that in the long run, it's important to children to know that somebody cared enough to try to do something about this discrimination that has been going on for so long and that has negatively affected their lives.
And I can certainly understand why you want to continue to do that, but I am also wondering how hard that is for you. I mean, how many times do you have to tell those of us who are not Indigenous to kind of sit up and pay attention? I mean, that's such a burden on so many levels. I just wonder how you go forward some days.
Well, some days I wonder too, I have to say that. But I have a very supportive family, you know, and I have discussions with my family members all the time. Because, you know, when I retired as a judge, I said, finally, I get the chance to stay home. I'm pulling back from public life. And then 8 days later, the Prime Minister called and asked me to go to the Senate. And when I talked to them, I said, do you think I should do this? Because I did promise my wife, I promised Mom I would stay home. And she said, well, you've been home for a few weeks now, and you've organized the coverage 3 times. And I was going to tell you get a part-time job anyway. So I realized that maybe there's more out there that I still need to do. And that's what they said to me. There's more out there that you need to do. You just need to learn how to pace yourself and to take care of yourself as you're doing it. And so that's what I'm concentrating on. But the reality is that we must never give up the responsibility of doing what we can when we can. And you know, the teaching that I have learned since I was a young boy is that at the end of my life, I will be turned around on my spirit journey. They will turn me around, and they will make me look back at the trail that I created in this world, and they will ask me to account for everything I did, but also everything I didn't do that I could have done. And I have to be prepared to speak for that. And I want to be able to speak about this thing when I'm ready to go.
That is a really powerful image of speaking for that. I was going to ask you, when you were a boy, did you, and you were trying to dodge your grandmother's idea of making you a priest, did you ever think that you would be doing the kind of work you're doing now and the kind of work you have done?
No. In fact, I tell students I never aspired to be a leader, never aspired to be a public figure. I only ever wanted to be, I like writing. I wanted to learn how to write. But I never aspired, and I like playing sports. My ambition from early on in life was to play sports for as long as I could, and then to teach sports for as long as I could. And that was it. But based upon my grandmother's direction and my own interest level as it evolved over the years in late high school and early university, and the influence of writers that I found, as well as speakers that I heard, and not just Indigenous speakers, they were important, but also people like Gandhi and people like Mandela when he was freed, and also his writings and there's writings about him, and John F. Kennedy, and some of the things that they were saying resonated with me. And that made me feel that sense of responsibility that I had to do what I could with what I had. And so that's what I've tried to do. I've always tried to do it. But if you were to ask me now, how would you like to spend the rest of your life? I would tell you, I'd like to spend the rest of my life reading to children. because I loved reading. In fact, if I could find somebody who would pay me to record books all the time, that's all I would do is record Audible books.
I'm sure you could actually, now that you said that, you're going to get a phone call. But, you know, I want to pick up on what you said about being a leader, because I think that that's really important, that it's not necessarily about saying, I'm going to be a leader and going forward that way. It's about what you care about. It's what you think is important for those, for your people that made you a leader. It was your actions that then created that leadership.
I often get asked by young Indigenous people who are sort of thinking about seeking out a leadership position. They'll ask me to help them come to a decision about running for office or running for chief or running for council in their community. And they'll ask me, what do I think? And I said, before you can be a leader, you have to learn to love the people, because they won't always love you. And if you can learn to accept that and learn to continue to do what you have to do, despite the fact that there are people who are telling you that they don't like what you're doing, you have the capacity to lead them. You have to learn to love the people, even though they don't love you. And that's
Have you found that? Have there been times when people didn't love what you were doing?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. When I was in the Senate, I tell people that I had one staff person whose full-time job was to keep track of the hate mail that came into me, and anything that appeared to be a threat to my safety was referred to the parliamentary security people, because they're, senators just walk around Ottawa like they're ordinary people, and so it's easy to be a target. And same with the judiciary. But yeah, there's a lot of people in Canada who don't like me, and I know that. I've had police details who monitored my house for a while.
There are a lot more people in Canada who admire you, Marie Sinclair.
I hope so.
We're going to have to wrap it up, but I wonder if you can just share with us maybe a little more of your wisdom as we think about leadership, and you think about the kinds of hurdles that you have had. What do you want the students who are listening to you right now to understand about their own journey?
Well, the business world is always a challenging one. It will always be a challenging one, because the goals and ambitions and the way in which you are being educated about your role in the business environment is going to be a challenge to your sense of right and wrong. And even though it'll be presented in a neutral way, there'll be parts of it that will make you wonder whether, in fact, that's something that you agree with. But I always say that there is no part of this world that is totally inflexible to allowing for difference. And that you need, if you feel the need to be able to express yourself in that different way, then you should. And in particular, if you see injustice, you should right it. And if you see something that needs to be fixed, then you should fix it. And if there is something good that you can do, then you should do it. I think it's as simple as when you're walking down the street and you see somebody who is homeless, you should always ask them if they're okay. I do that all the time. And the reason I do that is because my dad lived on the street for much of his life. And I always wondered, what was it like for him when people just kept walking by and he was suffering as he was suffering. And when I see young girls who are sitting on the side of the street who are looking helpless, I always ask them if they're okay, whether there's anything that I can do to help them. And sometimes it's just to give them money. And I know that sometimes people criticize me for giving money to people who are homeless on the side of the street. But I always say to them, if that were my daughter, I hope that someone would give them money so that they could at least have a chance to buy some food. But that's important. It's important for you to feel. It's important for you to have empathy. It's important for you to look upon every person as though they were someone you loved. Because if you understand your role in life and the opportunities you have been presented, you really are supposed to love everybody.
Marie Sinclair, we're going to leave it there, but thank you for so much wisdom, for sharing your thoughts with us today. There's a lot to take away. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna Marie. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
So, Senator Sinclair, it was an absolute honor to have you with us. Thank you so much for a very thoughtful conversation. There are so many things that you shared with us. I'd like to highlight two. Really hit me hard when you talked about, you know, all of us, including newcomers, have this important responsibility to the future of the country. And so you certainly gave us much to reflect on and act on. I've also seen a person, a leader. We oftentimes talk about leader character, and once again, you demonstrated that today. You modeled that today, talking about empathy and feeling. But good leadership is also about the commitment to the role of leadership, doing the hard work of leadership. And again, when you spoke about when your time is up, the burial, I thought it was an exceptionally powerful part of our conversation this afternoon, and I thank you for that. I know that you have started your next high-stakes assignment to chair negotiations on the federal compensation for First Nations children. Of course, we wish you and all your loved ones well. Anna Maria Tremonti, thank you for your time again, and the interest you take in our work on leader character. We consider you a friend of the Institute, although your comment around Queens was, I should say, a little cringe-worthy, but we'll forgive you, all right? To our audience, you know, thank you so much for tuning in today. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Of course, we will send you a link with a recording of the webinar over the coming days, and please feel free to distribute this important conversation. Before we sign off, I would like to extend a sincere thanks to my Ivey colleagues, Kimberly Milani, Sarah McCabe, and our outstanding Ivey IT team members, Joe Rylett, Kevin Luiten, and Darren Eveland. To all of you, enjoy the rest of the day, stay safe, and bye for now.